How could one man, with no modern tools, build a ship longer than a football field designed to save the entire world? We're about to decode the actual construction of Noah's Ark, revealing every forgotten engineering detail that made this miracle possible. But this story begins not with a hammer, but with a whisper, a voice from God with a command that would shatter a man's reality. Build yourself an ark. And in that moment, Noah, a man of faith, was given a burden that would make him an outcast. He wasn't just told to build a boat, he was told to build a refuge for life itself in a world that didn't even know what rain was. The laughter started almost immediately. His neighbors, his friends, they all saw a man gone mad, working on a wooden monster for a flood that made no sense. Every swing of his axe was met with a chorus of doubt. Every day the pressure mounted. Could he really do this? Was he hearing God, or was he losing his mind? This was Noah's first and greatest test, to silence the world outside and the fear inside, and simply begin to build. And the very first step of this divine project wasn't glorious. It was dirt, miles of it. A structure that massive, 450 feet long, couldn't be built on just any patch of ground. It needed a foundation that was wide, firm, and perfectly stable, far from any dangerous slopes. It also had to be close to the source of his material, the towering forests of gopher wood. So imagine Noah, a man in his later years, walking the land. He wasn't just looking, he was analyzing, feeling the soil under his feet, checking its firmness, judging the distance to the trees. He had no surveyors, no engineers, no maps. All he had was practical wisdom, a lifetime of experience, and a deep, unshakable faith. When he finally found the perfect spot, the real work began, and it was brutal. He and his sons spent months, maybe years, clearing huge stones, ripping out stubborn roots, and leveling every single foot of that ground. They compacted the soil by hand, pounding it firm enough to support thousands of tons of wood. But they faced a strange problem, unique to that ancient world. The Bible tells us that before the flood, a mist rose from the earth and watered the ground. This means the soil was always damp, and damp soil easily turns to mud. Imagine their frustration. Tools would sink. The precious wood would absorb moisture and begin to warp. The ground itself became a muddy trap. So Noah had to become a civil engineer. He likely dug a series of small channels all around the worksite, simple trenches to divert the constant moisture away from his foundation. It wasn't rain from the sky he was fighting, it was the earth itself weeping. And all the while, people would pass by and watch. They'd laugh, they'd whisper, "Look at the old fool fighting the mud. Why prepare a piece of land big enough to hold a mountain?" But Noah never gave them an answer, because he wasn't building by their logic. He was building by God's instruction. When the ground was finally solid, a new mountain rose before him, gathering the wood. The command was specific: make the ark of gopher wood. Modern scholars debate if this was cypress or another strong resinous wood, but one thing is certain: these trees were giants. They were ancient, thick, and incredibly heavy, perfect for a project of this scale. Felling just one of these giants with a simple bronze axe was a monumental task. It required relentless strength and endless patience. Felling hundreds of them? That was a lifetime of work crammed into a few decades. Day after day, the forest echoed with the thud of their axes, blow after blow, trunk after trunk. Noah and his sons worked until the final deafening crack and the ground-shaking crash of another tree coming down. But the work didn't stop there. How do you move a multi-ton log miles to your construction site without wheels, powerful animals, or machines? They used a technique as old as time itself: wooden rollers. They would place smaller, smoother logs underneath the massive trunk. Then, using ropes and sheer manpower, they would pull and push, moving the giant log just a few feet at a time. As it inched forward, they'd run to the back, grab the roller that just came free, and race to the front to place it down again. It was slow, it was exhausting, and it was incredibly dangerous. A single slip could mean a crushed limb or worse. But with every log that arrived at the site, their faith was made real. It was another step forward in the great work God had commanded. While all this was happening, the locals saw it all. Men covered in sweat and sawdust, dragging these impossible logs to a giant empty field. It must have looked like madness. The mocking grew louder, the doubts became sharper, but none of it stopped Noah. He wasn't working for their approval. He was working for an audience of one. With a mountain of timber finally piled high, the time came for the most complex part of the work. It wasn't just about cutting and moving anymore. It was about building a structure so strong it could survive the most violent storm in the history of the world. For the ark to be straight and tough, Noah had to start with its foundation, the backbone of the entire ship, known as the keel. Now, the Bible doesn't give us the step-by-step process, but any ancient shipbuilder would know the first impossible problem. The ark was to be 450 feet long. No tree on earth grows that tall. Not then, not now. This meant Noah couldn't use a single piece of wood for the keel. He had to join multiple massive beams together, end to end, to form one continuous solid line. This demanded incredible precision. He and his sons would have spent weeks on each joint, carving complex interlocking patterns into the ends of the beams, like giant puzzle pieces. These are called scarf joints. When fitted together and secured with huge wooden pegs called dowels, they create a bond almost as strong as a single piece of wood. But even with the best joints, the keel was vulnerable. As they began to lift the first massive curved ribs of the hull into place, the strain was immense. Suddenly, with a sound that ripped through the air like thunder, one of the main joints on the keel splintered. A giant crack appeared. The entire project was on the verge of collapse. The work stopped. His sons looked at him, their faces filled with fear. All the ridicule of their neighbors suddenly felt true. Had they been wasting their lives on a fool's dream? In that moment of crisis, Noah, with sawdust in his beard and despair in his heart, must have prayed. And the answer came not in a voice, but in an idea. They would laminate it. They would bolt on additional beams, overlapping the weak joints, creating a layered, reinforced spine that was even stronger than the original design. It was a moment of failure that led to a triumph of engineering. With the keel secured, the skeleton of the ark finally began to rise from the earth. Imagine the scene. Dozens of enormous, curved ribs, each weighing thousands of pounds, being lifted into place with nothing but ropes, levers, and raw human strength. Noah and his sons, muscles straining, pulling and adjusting, checking every angle. If just one rib was tilted incorrectly, the entire ship would lose its balance and be torn apart by the waves. They probably stretched long ropes from one end of the keel to the other, creating guidelines to keep everything true. They would use simple plumb lines, a stone tied to a string, to make sure every vertical beam was perfectly straight. And they repeated this process over and over, dozens of times. As the skeleton of the ark took shape, it must have been an awe-inspiring sight. A gigantic wooden frame rising from a field where there had never been a sea. It was the size of a modern skyscraper, but built with nothing more than simple tools and human hands, guided by a divine blueprint. And then came one of the most vital jobs, sealing the ark. A beautiful frame is useless if it leaks. God's instruction was direct: cover it inside and out with pitch. This detail is brilliant. Pitch, or bitumen, is a natural tar-like substance that seeps from the ground. It had to be collected, boiled in huge pots until it was a thick, bubbling liquid, and then applied while scorching hot. As it cooled, it would create a hard, waterproof shell. But just coating the outside wasn't enough. Wood breathes. Over time, it absorbs moisture. Even a small, slow leak could rot the frame from the inside out, dooming the entire vessel. So Noah and his sons spent months on this messy, grueling task. They covered every plank, every joint, every single crack, both inside and out. They had to wait for each layer to fully dry and harden before applying the next. Any missed spot, any tiny flaw could compromise the whole project. When the last section was finally sealed, the Ark was no longer just a wooden structure. It was an airtight fortress designed to face a catastrophe the world couldn't even imagine. Imagine the scene. Dozens of enormous, curved ribs, each weighing thousands of pounds, being lifted into place with nothing but ropes, levers, and raw human strength. Noah and his sons, muscles straining, pulling and adjusting, checking every angle. If just one rib was tilted incorrectly, the entire ship would lose its balance and be torn apart by the waves. They probably stretched long ropes from one end of the keel to the other, creating guidelines to keep everything true. They would use simple plumb lines, a stone tied to a string, to make sure every vertical beam was perfectly straight. And they repeated this process over and over, dozens of times. As the skeleton of the Ark took shape, it must have been an awe-inspiring sight. A gigantic wooden frame rising from a field where there had never been a sea. It was the size of a modern skyscraper, but built with nothing more than simple tools and human hands, guided by a divine blueprint. But this created another life-or-death problem: ventilation. With thousands of animals packed together, the buildup of waste and gases like ammonia and methane would be deadly. The Bible mentions one specific opening, a tzohar, a window or light source, a cubit high running along the top. But one window wouldn't be enough to ventilate 3 entire floors. Ancient ship designs give us a clue. Noah likely built a sophisticated airflow system, small, protected openings along the sides, covered by overhangs to keep water out, would allow fresh air to enter the lower decks. As this cooler air came in, it would push the warmer, foul air up through internal shafts and corridors, finally exiting through the long window at the top. It was a natural, chimney-like effect, circulating air throughout the entire vessel without any need for fans. This system was absolutely critical. Without it, the air inside would have become toxic within weeks. Then there was the issue of food. A year's worth of food for every creature on board. The sheer volume is staggering. The Bible says, "You shall take with you every kind of food that is eaten." This meant mountains of hay, tons of grains, dried fruits, nuts, and seeds, all stored in the way to keep it dry and free from pests. And that doesn't even include the water. They would have needed thousands of gallons of fresh water, stored in clay jars and wineskins. Huge sections of the Ark had to be dedicated solely to storage. It wasn't just a boat, it was a floating barn, a grocery store, and a silo all in one. And what about the waste? With thousands of animals, waste disposal was a major challenge. Some designs suggest the floors were slightly sloped, allowing waste to collect in channels that could be flushed out through small sealed holes in the hull. Others propose a moon pool, a central opening in the bottom floor that allowed waste to be dropped directly into the ocean below while still protecting the Ark from taking on water. When every stall was built, every corridor planned, and every storeroom packed, Noah knew the work was nearing its most critical point: the door. It had to be a gigantic opening, big enough for an elephant to walk through, but also strong enough that it didn't weaken the entire structure of the hull. A hole that big is a ship's greatest vulnerability. To solve this, Noah would have heavily reinforced the frame around the door with thick diagonal beams and the strongest wood he had. He didn't have giant metal hinges like we do today. The most likely design was a massive vertical pivot, a huge reinforced wooden post on one side of the door that allowed it to swing open and shut. But this door was more than just an engineering feat. It was a symbol, because the Bible tells us something extraordinary. Noah built the door, but it was God who would close it. Before the animals arrived, Noah surely walked the silent decks one last time. He would run his hands over the smooth, hardened pitch. He'd stomp on the floorboards, listening for any weakness. He'd check every joint, every peg, every beam. A huge wooden structure like this isn't silent. It groans, it creaks, it settles. And after decades of construction, Noah would know its language. He would know if something was wrong just by the sounds it made. And then, as he stood there, satisfied that the work was complete, something supernatural happened. The animals came. The Bible is clear. They weren't hunted down or rounded up. They simply came. It began as a trickle, then became a flood of life. Pairs of animals emerging from the forest, flocks of birds darkening the sky as they landed near the entrance, wild predators walking calmly beside their natural prey. An invisible hand was guiding each species, an orchestrated movement of creation. There was no chaos, no fear, no attacks. It was the final divine seal on the project. This wasn't just a man's work, it was God's. When every last creature was inside, every bird, every reptile, every beast, Noah and his family entered. His wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. 8 people in all. The work was finally done. Faith had been turned into reality. And as Noah stood at the threshold, he took one last look at the world he knew. At the green hills, the familiar trees, the faces of the people who had mocked him for 100 years. He didn't close the door himself. The scripture says, "And the Lord shut him in." A deep, final thud echoed as the massive door swung shut, sealed not by man's hand, but by God's. A profound silence fell over the interior of the ark. Outside, the world went on, oblivious. Inside, everything was ready. It was the beginning of the end and the beginning of everything. The Bible describes the moment with chilling words. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. This wasn't just rain. The first thing they felt was the earth itself tearing apart, a violent, deep trembling as underground oceans erupted to the surface. Earthquakes, fissures. The ark would have shaken violently, not from water above, but from the fury of the planet below. Then the floodgates of heaven opened. For the first time in human history, it rained. And it wasn't a gentle shower, it was a deafening roar. Thick, heavy drops hammering on the roof, a sound so loud it would have drowned out all thought. Thunder cracked, and lightning lit up the dark interior through the high window. The ark, motionless for so long, began to feel the first touch of water pooling around its base. Imagine the people outside, the laughter turning to confusion, then to panic, shouts at the strange water falling from the sky, astonishment as the ground turned to a raging sea in minutes. The ark, which had been a symbol of one man's madness, suddenly became the only symbol of hope. But it was too late. The door was sealed. Through the thick gopher wood walls, Noah's family could likely hear the muffled screams of their neighbors, the sound of fists pounding on the hall, begging for entry. And then the sounds faded, replaced only by the roar of the water. The water rose and rose until the heavy, immovable ark began to groan. And then it happened. A gentle lift, the creaking of 1,000 joints adjusting to a new pressure. The floor vibrated as the ship, for the very first time, broke free from the earth and began to float. The vessel that took a century to build was finally fulfilling its purpose. It had no sails, no oars, no rudder. It didn't need them. It was a vessel of preservation, not navigation. Its course was set by God's own hand. The Bible says the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. Mountains disappeared, cities were submerged, all life was extinguished. Inside the ark, it was a self-contained world. Outside, a world of death. The contrast was absolute. The rain fell for 40 days, but the flood was far from over. The waters continued to rise for 150 days, 5 months. Inside the ark, time seemed to stand still. Their life was a monotonous cycle of work in the dim light, feeding the animals, cleaning the stalls, checking the beams for stress fractures, and waiting, praying, holding on to hope in a wooden world tossed on an endless ocean. And then, after long months, the Bible reveals a turning point with 3 beautiful words. But God remembered Noah. A wind began to blow over the face of the water. Slowly, day by day, the water level began to drop, until finally, with a soft jolt, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. After months of near darkness, Noah opened the window. For the first time in nearly a year, fresh air and bright sunlight flooded the top deck. But he couldn't see the ground. Was the earth ready? He performed a simple, wise test. He released a raven, a tough scavenger bird. It flew back and forth, finding no place to land. The world was still a swamp. A week later, he released a dove. It returned quickly, unable to find rest. The world was still water. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove out again. This time it returned in the evening, and in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was the first sign of new life, the first promise of a new beginning, hope in the form of a single leaf. Noah waited 1 more week. He released the dove a 3rd time, and this time it did not return. The earth was ready. After more than a year inside that ark, God spoke again. "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you." And Noah obeyed. The door, the very one God had closed, was now open. An intense, blinding light filled the interior. The animals began to emerge, species by species, dispersing into the clean new world. Then the family stepped out onto firm ground. The smell of wet earth, the pure air, the profound, unbroken silence. Everything was new. Nothing from the old world had survived, but life had been preserved. And the very first thing Noah did was not build a house or plant a field. He built an altar. There, among the rocks and mud of a restored world, Noah gave thanks. And God was pleased. He made a promise, a covenant for all time. "Never again will I destroy all life with water." And he placed a sign in the clouds to seal that promise, the rainbow, a vibrant arc of color, a bridge between heaven and earth, a reminder that even after the greatest judgment, there is grace. The ark had fulfilled its purpose. Its story was over. Now a new chapter for humanity would begin. From those 8 people, all the nations of the earth would be born. And the ark, a monument of obedience and salvation, remained on that mountain as a silent testament to the man who trusted God's voice, even when the whole world called him crazy. The ark was never just a boat. It was faith built out of wood. It was hope preserved on 3 levels, and it was proof that God's love for life is stronger than any storm. But Noah's story doesn't end when he steps off the ark. The challenges of starting humanity over in an empty world were immense, and how that new covenant shaped the future of mankind is a story all its own. To discover what happened after the flood, click on the video you see on your screen. And I have one question for you. What single detail about the ark's construction truly amazed you the most? Let me know in the comments below.